So yeah, I'm really, really excited to be giving this talk actually, and I've actually imagined giving talks at the Buddhist Center before. I do talk here as a yoga teacher quite a lot, but I've always wanted to do one of these personal talks. I just didn't imagine that I'd be doing it to an empty room, or virtually empty room, but there you are. So when I was first asked to do this talk, well, initially I was really pleased. I thought, great, I love, talking and talking about myself, so that's really good. And then that was closely followed by a fear that I was like, oh, I actually probably don't know enough about the Buddha to give a talk about the Buddha. And so I should probably spend the next week researching everything I can about Buddhism and listening to lots of talks and stuff, and so I sound really impressive and scholarly, and everyone thinks I'm really knowledgeable. And then I thought, I've actually just misunderstood the question, haven't I? Because it's not about me telling you about the Buddha, it's about my relationship to Buddhism. So then I had to go back to the drawing board. I'm going to. I'll start with a little personal introduction, and then I'll focus on a couple of different ways that the Buddha and my relationship to the Buddha has sort of changed me or changed aspects of myself. Very brief introduction. I work here at the London Buddhist Centre. I live in London. I've lived in London for most of my life. My family I live quite close to my parents. My mum is Mexican, and I've got one sister who I think is watching. In fact, I hope the rest of the family is as well. Hi, Mum. Dual nationality, Mexican, English. Lived in London for most of my life, apart from when I went to study at Oxford. I studied music, and I worked in the music industry for a couple of years after I graduated. Didn't like it very much, so I retrained as a yoga teacher about 3 years ago. So that's me in a nutshell. Except it doesn't really say anything, does it? So the first thing I want to talk about is an event that really shaped. I think it's really shaped my life, actually. And it happened, I had a really bad accident when I was 5 years old. I fell over the banisters in my house on the top floor, and I fell down, sort of free fall down 2 flights of stairs to the ground floor, and I fell in front of my mum's face. I think she might have thought that I had died, and I was really quite seriously injured. I'm quite lucky to have recovered fully. I had quite a large head trauma, and I fractured my femur bone sort of right up the middle. And I spent nearly 2 months in hospital. And it was a really, really traumatic time for me and also for my whole family. And although I did recover fully quite quickly because I was just really lucky and I was so young. So physically, I recovered fairly quickly and completely. But I was definitely left with some quite traumatic. I developed post-traumatic stress disorder, which manifested itself in all sorts of ways. So some ways you might sort of imagine that would sort of follow on. Like, I was really, really scared of heights, and I still am. I was very scared of falling, just quite fearful. Like, don't really like fairground rides and stuff like that. But then it also sort of permeated the rest of my life and my experience, in that I was just very generally fearful. I became incredibly anxious around things that you wouldn't even imagine, especially not as a 5-year-old, to be worrying about. So, for example, when my dad went to take the bins out at night and I was in bed, I'd sort of shoot out of bed and come out of my room and check that he could make his way back into the house okay. Everything was like the worst case scenario. I'd really catastrophized, and I'd lie in bed at night thinking about all the really horrible things that might happen. And the more I saw suffering, in a way, the worse it got. So when I went to Mexico, I would see real poverty in a way that I hadn't seen, I hadn't been exposed to in my life in London. So I'd see children my age sort of living in the street, and I'd be deeply affected for months afterwards. And I'd say to my mum, when she'd question me about what was wrong, I'd just be like, well, bad things happen, like they do. Bad things happen. Because they happened to me. And, there's nothing that she could say to soothe me, because I'd had my own experience of that suffering. And then as an adult, as an adolescent and an adult, that thread of a real awareness of suffering and anxiety and fear, it definitely continued. But it started to manifest itself in a real wanting to control things. So I became really protective over certain people that were close to me, friends or partners or family, like my sister. I'd be so protective because I was so worried about something happening to them, So I was trying to control people. I thought if I keep them in my eyesight, then nothing bad can happen to them. I was trying to control situations to make them safe. I was sort of hyper vigilant. And then I was also sort of trying to control my feelings. So I was in fact, it was the opposite. I felt like I was completely out of control of my feelings, like I was completely governed by this fear. And I didn't know what to do with it. And it felt very overwhelming, and it would just come out in all sorts of unpleasant ways, mostly sort of anger. So when I came to the Buddhist Center for the first time a couple of years ago, one of the first things I remember learning about was that the Buddha taught that suffering is just a part of our experience. To live, to be human, to live as we do is to suffer. And I remember thinking, oh, thank God for that, because I thought there was something wrong with me, like deeply wrong with me, because all I could see was suffering. And I was like, oh, well, that's just such a relief, because I really thought that something was just going on. And in some ways I had all the things that I wanted, or I had, I was lucky enough to be quite academic. So I got I got all my exams done and got my degree and went into work. And in a way, like, my life was sort of, I ticked everything off, but I was still just so, I felt so much existential angst and confusion. And I really just thought there was something wrong with me for feeling all of that, and I felt guilty for it. And so, I remember feeling very relieved that suffering is okay, that's normal. And then even more relieved to find out that there was a path that I could follow that would lead me away from suffering, and that I could just try it out and see if it worked. So that's sort of the first way that Buddhism started to change my life. And then the next thing I'm going to talk about is the imagination. So in tandem with this really wild mind that would take me to very dark places, that would take me to these catastrophes and wild sort of fear that would keep me awake at night. I suppose the flip side of that was that I did actually love thinking, and I loved being creative, and I had all these sort of imaginary friends growing up, and I remember learning about the stars and the universe as quite a young child, and feeling like so small, and I'd just sort of look at the stars and be like, I'm so small. And then I remember learning about atoms, and I was like, but I'm so big, like there's so many atoms, there must be so many atoms in here. So I just remember really taking a lot of pleasure from all of that imagination, and I think I still do. But then I also had this sense of like, well, what is going on? Like, how can I be having all these really strong experiences in my mind, and that are taking me to the most sort of pleasurable and fantastic worlds, and then also to these like these really awful depths, and that I often can't really communicate to others. It was like, I almost felt like, well, what do I do with all of that? What do I do with all of this, these experiences that are so, they felt so profound in a way, and I just, I didn't know what to do with them. And well, I guess luckily I learned how to meditate. I first learned how to meditate about 8 years ago, and I learned how to meditate in a secular mindfulness course, and I started to see that, oh, okay, I can, to an extent, sort of work with my mind, and I can follow this thread of noticing. Well, in the case of that mindfulness context, it was like I can follow that thread of noticing sensations and noticing feelings, and in a way that felt very transformative. But in another way, it really wasn't enough at that point. And the thing that I remember most about that course, that mindfulness course that I did, the thing that I remember most about it is Chris, who was the guy who was running the course. And I was in a really bad way when I went on that course, and I think it was actually kind of prescribed, maybe as a way to help with depression. I think that's why I was on that course. And I just remember I was struggling with all these feelings of sort of self-hatred and existential crisis, and I'd never met anybody like Chris. I'd never met anybody who was quite so compassionate, warm, and open, and serene, but with a kind of, there was a steadfastness to him as well. Like, he wasn't a pushover. He wasn't just a nice guy. He had like depth as well. And I mean, he was a Buddhist. I later found out that he was a Buddhist, and it kind of made sense. But at the time, I just thought that it was completely unattainable for me to be anything like that. And I just thought, and I also had this sense that he probably wasn't just meditating on the breath or whatever. I was like, that there's probably a bit more to it than that. I was like, I want to be like you, but I have no idea how to get there. And so I thought, okay, it's probably not for me. It's probably my fault. I probably just can't do that. So it was a kind of another relief when I finally did sort of link up Buddhism with meditation, to find that there was a path which meditation sort of sat in, but there were other aspects to it as well. So to practice Buddhism, for me, it's a practice of meditation. It's a practice of ethics and kind of cultivation of awareness, and it's a bit more rounded. And I suddenly had this sense like, oh, that's why I should meditate, or that's what meditation's for. It's not just so that I can be more aware for myself. It's not even just a tool to make me feel less depressed. Meditation within Buddhism, it will help me to develop as a person, and then I can be a better person for myself and for everybody in my life. And in a way, that's where the imagination comes in, because I think to step into relationship with the Buddha, or for me to step into relationship with the Buddha, I think it calls on me to use my imagination on and off the cushion. So in meditation, I can imagine, I can use that imagination to, think about bathing my friends in a sort of a warm, loving light, and then extending that loving light to the rest of the world. And I can sort of channel that imagination in that direction. And then in my daily life, in my sort of ethical practice, I can imagine what is the wisest, kindest response that I could give. Like, what would it be like to be able to act in any given situation freed from the narrow confines of my own self-interest. And I was thinking, like, you need to give an example. I was like, I really don't want to, because it will show me up, but I'm going to anyway, and I'm almost done. But well, the other day there was one biscuit left in my house. I live with 2 other women, and I didn't want it then, but I did want it at some point. I knew I wanted that last biscuit. It's a really nice biscuit. So I hid it. I hid it in, when we have communal food, but I hid it in my cupboard behind lots of tins of beans so that I could go and get the biscuit later. And then when I was eating it, I was like, oh, this just wasn't worth it. I feel really guilty. And well, it did just make me think, well, there was probably a better response there, wasn't it? And I mean, that's just one of like thousands of millions of examples that I could give of ways that I fall short of these ideals that I set myself. But in a way, now at least I have an ideal to fall away from, because at least I'm pointing in the right direction. So if I fall short, and if I'm not kind, and I'm not aware, and I'm not wise, then at least I hopefully am gathered, imaginatively speaking, but then also in a practical and physical sense, kind of pointing in the right direction, so that if I fail, then I can hopefully call on my imagination to inspire me to move forwards, to keep moving along the spiritual path. So yeah, I think that's really it. So for me, the Buddha represents this acknowledgement of suffering, and also the path that I can try out, that I can try to follow, that will lead me away from this suffering. And in a way that the Buddha is an embodiment of my own capacity to change, to grow, to call on my imagination. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.